Welcome to Hanging at the Reef. I'm your host, Jeffrey Rich, and today I'm excited to introduce a truly distinguished scholar, Dr. Douglas Askman. Dr. Askman is a professor of history at Hawaii Pacific University with a PhD from UCLA. He brings decades of expertise in modern and early European history, as well as deep insights into Hawaii's own historical narrative. His impressive career includes multiple Department Teacher of the Year awards and service as a certified docent at the Iolani Palace. He serves as an honorary alihi at the Royal Order of Kamehameha. All of these efforts reflect his passion for connecting students and community members with the rich cultural heritage of Hawaii. Today, Dr. Askman will share his knowledge about the historic Aloha Tower, a cherished landmark here on the island of Oahu in Hawaii, and a fixture on HPU's Aloha Tower Marketplace campus. We'll discuss the Aloha Tower's upcoming centennial celebration and the collaborative project Doug has led to bring students and the community together to identify and tell stories of the tower and the broader harbor area that surrounds it. Please join me in welcoming Professor Askman to the show. So let's start with Aloha Tower itself. Can you tell us a little bit about the historical significance of the tower? Why is it such a landmark and a fixture here on the island of Oahu?
Well, one of the exciting things about the tower is its 100th anniversary is coming up. So 1926, the tower was constructed, and we now live in the jet age. So when people come to Hawaii, they come by air, primarily by air. But before the jet engine, Aloha Tower was essentially our airport. Visitors would have come and seen the tower. So it was a lighthouse, used as a lighthouse. And on all four sides, the word Aloha is carved. So it would have been the first thing that visitors would have seen when they came to Hawaii. So it's something that today is lost, I think, on people because we live in an age of airplanes. But in the age of sea travel and ocean travel, this would have been the first entry point for visitors when they came to Hawaii.
So it was really thought of as a lighthouse about 100 years ago?
Yes, it would have been a lighthouse. It would have been guiding ships in and out. There had been something that was sort of like that before, going back to the 1800s, where there was a tower, there was a clock tower, sort of a mini version of Aloha Tower that was in the vicinity of about where Fort and Nimitz are located now. And that was torn down actually when Aloha Tower was completed, but it was something that people would see from a distance. It was something that people saw as an entry point. It was something that people saw as a landmark for Hawaii as well.
What about its significance during World War II, for example? I imagine, it was one of the highest buildings, tallest buildings on the island for many years. Would have obviously been standing during that period. I think it has military installations on some level today. But how about its military applications back, around the time of World War II up to today?
So we're used to, I think, seeing the tower in its sort of gray color scheme now, but during World War II, it was taken over by the military and it was camouflaged. So there are some interesting pictures showing it with camouflage and then also with the soldiers on the front of it. So it was used for directing Pacific operations during World War II, and the public was actually not allowed to have access to it during that time. It's only a couple of years after the war that area is reopened to the public. So now we think of it as sort of a public landmark, but at one time it would have been an off-limit space during the war.
And I think it still is on some level. I know it's not open to the public at the moment. One of the hopes going forward is that they will reopen the stairs to the top and make it even more of a tourist destination that it remains today. And I think that's what's interesting to me is the tower still stands as one of the iconic landmarks on the island of Oahu, and it still gets a large amount of tourist traffic to come by and check it out. So that's interesting. And I know this leads us right to the core of the project that we're going to talk a bit about. And for those that have visited Aloha Tower and go inside the base level or around the outside, there's a number of storyboards that tell or attempt to tell some stories of the tower in the area. And I think for those that have seen those storyboards recently, they're in quite a state of disrepair. So that's kind of where we start the story, the desire to update those boards and to tell some of the interesting stories of historical significance about the tower. And that's how you and I intersected when we decided, okay, what can we do to bring life back to this tower? It still gets a lot of tourists coming by to look at it. There are a couple of stories that are still visible and readable in the tower, but for the most part, those narratives have to be updated. So let's start there. So your class got involved in this, and you guys were charged with figuring out new stories and new narratives that we could tell at that location. So let's start there.
Yeah, so we had my upper division Hawaiian history class be part of this project. And so I think all students know of Aloha Tower, but how much do they actually know of it? So we sort of began the project by having a meeting with your department over there to give a sort of a walkthrough. Yeah, marketing, to have everybody sort of be on the same page about what spaces we were looking at. I think for some of the students, it was probably the first time they had actually seen some of those signboards. So those signboards were, I think, done in the early 90s when the whole sort of renovation, Aloha Tower Marketplace was going up, and they are pretty beaten and weathered. I think in some of the text boxes, you can't even read anything at all. So we sort of had everybody take a look to see what the spaces were like. We talked about some new ideas. I think you had looked into the possibility of having some digital sort of updated technology there where we could flip some of the stories and have people look at different things. And I think you're right about the tourist traffic. So it isn't Waikiki, but it is a place that gets a fairly significant amount of tourist traffic and also people in the community taking a look at that space as well. In fact, I think when our group was over there checking out the space, we did see some tourists looking around, and it would have been very helpful if there were some signs to give some idea of what the history of the area is. I think a lot of the people who are around the downtown area don't really know. If they're visitors, they don't really know the history. And having that right there at the tower would be a perfect venue for bringing that information to our students, to the general public, Hawaii residents, but also to visitors who might be in the area.
Yeah, it's kind of been a missed opportunity for both the university and the state of Hawaii on some level, being such a tourist destination. And I'm always surprised at how many tourists I do see wandering around it, and I think that's probably an outcome of the cruise ships that dock there at Pier 10 in that area. But also, I know that the Waikiki Trolley has made it a stop, on their tour. So, it's regaining some prominence and significance. And our ability to create really interesting narratives and to present those in compelling ways with visuals like photography for sure, and hopefully even some video that we can uncover, will make it even more of a tourist destination. So the charge was to update these multiple storyboards. I know that there's some discussion underway as to whether some of the presentation of those new stories that your students have worked on, will be done in a digital format, and that's our hope. But at a minimum, we know that we'll have brand new, updated, and compelling storyboards to tell some of the new narratives. So tell us about how the students went out and found stories. That had to be an exciting and interesting part of their assignment, and I can only imagine some of the stories that they dug up. But give us a little sense of how that went down.
Yeah, so it was an interesting process. Some of the students were more familiar with our area than others. We had some exchange students from Norway, for instance, who were less knowledgeable about the area. So we had some discussions about how we would come up with different topics and different sites that we could look at. So I developed a list. I chose about 50 different possibilities for students, and then students were able to choose what they wanted. And then also some students had some interesting ideas as well. So I was focused on buildings and those types of things, but some of the students wanted to talk about the harbor itself. Some of them wanted to talk about the wildlife in that area. Some of them wanted to talk about the impact of commercialization. And so they had their own topics to add to it as well. So it was a kind of a fun process. I put the list up in the class, and then the students were sort of picking and choosing, and there was a little competition. Somebody said, well, but I wanted that one. And so it was interesting, and I think it was also a positive experience to see the students excited about finding that information, even maybe arguing over who could do which parts of it. So we had that list, and then the students chose about 3 or 4 different possibilities. And then they started to do the research on that. And that would include it. I had them look for historic photos. So I gave them information about the Hawaii State Archives website where they found some interesting stuff. That's a website that, especially as you learn to use it more, you learn how to search with keywords, you can find some interesting stuff. And I also had them take photos themselves of the sites as well. And so that was kind of fun. There were a couple of cases of difficulties. There was some fencing that was up. And so one of the students said I had to find a tall person to be able to put the camera over the fence to take some photos. So it was a challenge, but I think that was a great way for the students not to just do the work on their computers or do the research online, but that they could actually go to the place and take the photos of it. I think that made it a more active sort of process for the students, because that's, I think, part of the experiential learning is you're actually at the place that you're talking about.
Yeah, and I imagine that the visuals are an important and really interesting part of this project. Did the archival site that you mentioned have, photos and maybe old videos of the tower? Was that a source for that type of content, or were there other areas that the students were able to go out and source some older photography and imagery that maybe folks haven't seen of that area?
Well, most of the photos that the students found were from the State Archives website. So one of the issues that always is a concern when you're going to put up information is copyright. So we wanted to make sure that all of the photos were copyright free. So I had a little talk with the students about that and told them that everything on the State Archives website you can use for free as long as you cite them. And so the students were able to pulled up some of those camouflage images of Aloha Tower, which was kind of cool. And then they found some other photos that were on the website as well. One of the things I think they learned to do was to keyword search. So sometimes you can't just type in Aloha Tower, for instance. You've got to maybe look for some other keywords to look for. So I actually saw some photos that I had never seen before, and I know the archives website pretty well. So it was kind of exciting to see some historic photos and to see actually where students did find some things through other sources. I don't know if we'll be able to use them because they're not from the archives, but they did a pretty good job in finding information that was maybe kind of obscure, especially I think if it was something they were interested in. People talking about dredging and things like that I didn't expect.
And there was a community connection component to this project as well, and a sourcing of story ideas or narratives from the community. Tell us a little bit about how that went.
So Greg Fishback put out a story in midweek asking for the public's information on Aloha Tower. I was a little bit skeptical at first because it's almost 100 years old. So there aren't going to be that many people who are probably going to have recent experiences with it when it was a big transit center, unlike it is today. But we got some really interesting things. We got some interesting photos that people sent, and we had someone who had, I think, a grandparent living near the area when the tower was constructed, and had some photos of it being constructed. And those photos have probably never been seen by anybody besides the family. So when we go to the 100th anniversary, we might want to see if we can talk to some of those people and get their stories. So this is probably the sort of tail end of the era where there would be people who remember traveling. We had a woman who's older now, but as a child, she remembers getting on a ship to go to the Philippines from Aloha Tower. So I think she's obviously now older, but those stories are stories that are personal and kind of connect the area to the community.
Yeah, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of community interest in this as the public learns more about the outcome of this initiative, which is going to be an enhanced Aloha Tower with all sorts of interesting narratives that folks who live here as well as tourists can come and learn about. So, well, that takes us to, what were some of those stories? Were there interesting insights that came out of the process and new stories identified, or enhancements to stories perhaps that maybe some folks had heard before? But Give us a little taste of some of the narratives that that the students identified.
Well, I think the students chose a wide variety of different topics. And so we wanted to do something not just on the tower, but on the sort of community, the neighborhood. So I think of Aloha Tower as the sort of centerpiece of our campus community, but really the whole downtown area is something that I invited students to take a look at. So people looked at things like Iolani Palace, and they looked at King Kalakaua dying in San Francisco in 1891, the body coming into the harbor, and there's some photos even of that as well, a procession to the palace. So I think people were connecting the harbor space to the broader sort of downtown area, which is something that I think is valuable for students to realize that our campus is in such a historic location. Yes, we have Aloha Tower, but our whole the whole neighborhood is really historic as well. I think that's one of the things that the students got out of this, was to connect our campus to the history that's around it. A lot of times we walk down the street and we just sort of are looking at eye level, and we're not seeing the history that's there. Maybe we're not looking up, or maybe we're not looking down. And I think telling some of these stories will bring that to visitors to Aloha Tower, whether that's going to be some of our students who might be reading these new storyboards, or it might be visitors, or it might be local residents learning about not only the tower, but the whole area around it. So I see the tower as something that would connect downtown, all of historic downtown, sort of to our HBU campus.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm most excited about, is it's not just about Aloha Tower, but the broader area and all of the interesting, things that have happened throughout the history here of Hawaii. The story that you started to talk about is one that I've heard a little bit about. Maybe you could tell our listeners a little bit more about, this was the place where, upon the king's death, the first notification to the island as the fleet came back with the king's body. And I know that's a story that they tell at the Iolani Palace, too, of how the queen had stood on a balcony and had, I think, had chanted. But give us a little taste of that historical experience. I think that's a really interesting story.
Yeah, so King Kalakaua, who was the second to the last monarch of the Hawaiian Kingdom, died in San Francisco in 1891. And if we think back to that time period, there are telephones, but there would not, and a telegraph, but they would not have connected Hawaii to the U.S. at that time. So nobody knew about his death here until the ship came. So he was on a U.S. naval ship, and they were expecting that he was going to come back. And so the whole city was decorated for his return with banners and signs. And as the ship came around Diamond Head, it was covered in black. And there was a spotter who was always checking to see the ships are coming headed toward the harbor. News arrived that something had happened. At first, nobody really knew. They didn't know who had died. Maybe the captain of the ship had died, or maybe some other prominent person had died. But as the ship came closer into the harbor and people went out there, they learned that the king himself had died on the trip in California. And it was unexpected. He had some health issues before he left, and part of the reason for the trip was a sort of a medical trip to change in climate and such. But people were very shocked to hear that he had died, and his coffin is brought off the ship. And there are some really interesting archives photos showing the coffin being loaded onto a catafalque, which was a horse-drawn sort of carriage covered in black crepe with crowns, the crowns covered in black as well. And then that was processed down from the harbor to Iolani Palace, where his wife, Queen Kapi'olani, and his sister and successor, Lili'uokalani, were waiting. And it's a tragic scene. It's a historic scene. And it's, I think, something that connects us to the greater history of Hawaii and to the area, because that's really where we take what happened at the harbor, and then that's brought over to the palace when the king's remains are brought there.
That's a fascinating story. Was there another that really stood out to you, something of interest or something new that you had learned?
Well, I think one of the things that is harder to envision buildings that are no longer there, places that are no longer there. But one of the sites that's right in our immediate area about where the old Maritime Museum is today was the King's Boathouse. And so that building doesn't exist anymore, but some of the students found some photos of it, which was really cool. And then also to think about connections, again, from our area to the wider sort of history of Hawaii. We know that at that boathouse, Robert Louis Stevenson was a visitor. And there is a photo of him with Kalakaua seated at a table that is right at that boathouse. And I think it's really neat to kind of connect that story to our own campus community. And it's something that you wouldn't know from just looking around today because the building doesn't exist anymore. So I think there's that kind of wow factor that students get when they can see something that no longer exists, but know that it was there. I think that's something that students will share with their friends or families when they come and visit. I always hear students say, things that I learned, I tell my relatives when they come out to visit. So I think sharing a story, for instance, about the King's Boathouse is a good way to, again, kind of connect with the past with the present.
Yeah, now the King's Boathouse was the original man cave, right? That was
Yeah, it was, yeah. I think that's a good analogy. It was a place to sort of get away. And it was a place that I think where we can imagine today our harbor is so busy, but it would have been, it would have been a getaway, I think.
Yep. Do we know the exact spot that the boathouse stood on when what's there now?
It was about where the Maritime Museum.
Right in that location. So right in
that area. The photos of it show it sort of extended out. So there was a sort of a pier, and then it went out. It had a kind of unusual configuration because I think boats were actually kept. Some of them were actually kept in that space. There are a number of interesting photos of it sort of out in the harbor. So it wasn't right at the shoreline. It was built out a little bit, and it was torn down at the very end of the 19th century. So it's been gone for a long time, but is definitely part of our Aloha Tower history, at least of that area.
Well, it's a shame that they didn't keep the building intact and figure out a way to keep it renovated and turn it into another wonderful destination site. And now I think you've got, is it the Falls of Clyde right outside the Maritime Museum? Is there any history to that boat? I've heard that's scheduled to be pulled out of there at some point.
The history of the Falls of Clyde might be ending soon.
That's not going to make it to our...
Yeah, I think it's making its last stand. It might actually post its last stand at this point. I think that the state has decided that it is going to be removed. It's a very historic ship that was built in the 1870s in Scotland. So Falls of Clyde are a group of Scottish waterfalls. So very, another, I guess, maritime setting, but one that's in Europe. And it was part of a series of ships that was named after Scottish waterfalls that was built by this same company. It had a history being used by British shipping, and it is then purchased by Matson Navigation. So that's another kind of connector to today because we still see those Matson ships in the harbor. And it was used for a while to transport things like sugar between Hawaii and California. So it had a history here. It then goes to the West Coast. It's used for different things over there. It ends up being kind of neglected. It's an interesting story since it now looks so neglected, but it has a long history of being neglected. It ended up in the Pacific Northwest and they were going to get rid of it, but people here wanted it back. So money was actually raised to bring it back from Seattle and have it set up as a museum. So it's kind of ironic that we put so much effort into bringing it back and now nobody seems to want it anymore, but it is a very historic ship. It's a shame that it looks like it's not going to make it to its next, to a museum sort of space. It was offered to, I think, anyone who would want it if they could take it and move it someplace. And there was a group in Scotland that I think wanted to bring it back because it would be a popular site for people to see a Scottish ship back in Scotland. But the plans fell through for that. I'm not sure all the details for that, but I can imagine getting it back to Scotland would not be an easy or expensive process
at all. Well, for those that want to see the Falls of Clyde, the clock is ticking, so don't
That's right.
wait too long.
Get those photos now.
Well, all right. So this all sets up the what's happening in 2026 with the 100-year centennial celebration of the tower, and that's why this project is so timely and interesting. Because the goal is to get these stories updated and displayed in a way that we can present them in concert with the centennial celebration that starts in 2026. So tell us a bit about what to expect in the coming year.
Well, hopefully we can coordinate the renovation of the signage with the 100th anniversary of Aloha Tower. And I think that that's something that the timing just worked out really well with that. So since we're doing the updating of all of the storyboards, it's a perfect time, I think, to be talking about the tower on its 100th anniversary, and maybe, again, getting students involved in that, maybe doing some sort of a celebration. And I think also getting, again, the community involved, and maybe there will be a way for us to follow up on some of those stories that we got from the community, because I think it's not only an HPU landmark. It's something for the whole community to be involved with. And I think that some of those stories are really interesting. And there are folks out there who have some information that has not been shared before. So I think it's a perfect venue for maybe bringing out those photos that nobody has ever seen of the tower being constructed, or having people tell their sort of personal experiences of it. So I think it's going to be a celebration not only of the tower, but of our sort of work to redevelop that area, to have that new historical signage up, and maybe even to have those video boards where we can have a lot of information that maybe even visitors can choose what sort of things they want to get more information on.
Well, that is definitely our hope, is the ability to update not just the signage with static boards, but to put some digital monitors that would allow us to tell multiple stories in a single location, and to add, photos and video. So I know we're working on that behind the scenes now, and hope to have that entire solution in place as we begin to revamp this as we head into the centennial celebration in 2026. And I think one of the things that I thought was most interesting and compelling, that I know we talked about with the students, is that they really are, this is an opportunity for them to be a part of history, because our intent is, I don't think any of us knew exactly when the boards that are so decrepit right now went up. I wouldn't be surprised if those have been up since the 60s or maybe 70s. But it certainly is our hope that with the revamp and the new stories that we're rolling out with the new display boards, that these will live on for decades and decades. So it really is an opportunity for the students involved in this project to have a lasting legacy here in Hawaii, and to be a part of something that's really important to the community, to help tell those stories and to bring that tower to life for those that want to know its history. So that was very exciting. So next steps for us are to determine how to present the stories, and to select from a plethora of amazing content that your students have sourced, and to start to tell those stories visually as well as through narrative. And also, I should mention too, for our listeners, if anybody out there has a story of Aloha Tower or the downtown or harbor area, we'll put a place in our show notes where you can get in contact with us and let us know about that story, or submit some photos that maybe the world hasn't seen yet, as your class identified. So look for those connection points in this episode's show notes. So Doug, it's been a wonderful initiative, and I should also mention too that our hope is to have you back as a regular reoccurring guest, and one of our historical points of contact that can help us learn more about Hawaii's history and the broader history of other areas of the world as well. So we are very excited to have you be a returning guest here on Hanging at the Reef.
Well, the history is unlimited. So
always another story.
Yeah, that's one of the things I told the students, is I think that we will have more information than we need, and that is a good place to be.
Yes, absolutely. And that certainly is our hope. And now, whether we're able to display all of the wonderful stories and narratives that the students have identified and created narratives around at the tower itself, we can certainly present that content in a digital complement to Aloha Tower as well. So that's our intent, is to revitalize the tower, to bring life back to it in terms of telling the rich stories of the area and the tower. And I want to thank you and your class for being instrumental in helping us do that as we drive forward to now bring these stories physically into the tower's environment as we march towards the 2026 centennial celebration.
Looking forward to it.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for your time, and we look forward to having you back to talk to us more about interesting historical tidbits as we move forward.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being a guest, Doug, and we'll talk with you again soon.